You're listening to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories.
Something Up Ahead by Bran the Viking. This event had happened to me in the late summer of 2011, early August if memory serves. At that time in my life, I was living in a small town in northwest Washington called Bow Edison, a rural community south of Bellingham, north of Burlington-Sedro-Woolley, and that was off of the Chickenut Drive Highway. It's easily one of the most beautiful spots to visit. Bow Edison is essentially two small villages which overlap one another, with Bow being somewhat sparse and dotting the landscape with isolated farming homes, and Edison a bit of a hub village. They both exist in an intersecting location, geographically speaking. In a matter of minutes, you'll pass through flat farmland, hilly forests, rocky and densely wooded mountains, and oceanfront property. I had recently completed a year at trade school, attending the Job Corps program at Sedro-Woolley, and had just gotten my first job for the Skagit Valley Casino and Resort. Sadly, I didn't have many finances, only enough to cover rent for a room in an old farmhouse just off of Chuckanut. This was lucky for me, as it was only a few miles from the casino, which was just off the Interstate 5 and was a more than feasible ride on the hand-me-down bike I had procured shortly before graduating Job Corps. When I started, I was a dishwasher, and one that worked the swing or night shift. Getting to work was a bit of a pain. The ride was mostly uphill and along the windy Bow Hill Road, but over time it became manageable. I had just moved into the farmhouse and was starting my second week when I had first come to regret taking the night shift. Sadly, at this time, I only had a cheap gas station flashlight to illuminate my ride, which at night was made even darker since Bow Hill Road cut through dense forested areas and had several twists and bends, and it made the whole ride harrowing in some instances. My first ride home at around 3 in the morning hadn't gone well. Within minutes of departure, I had been attacked by an animal which darted out of the underbrush and tried biting at my right leg. I didn't see what precisely lunged out at me, though in hindsight I'm certain it was a coyote or a stray dog. Fortunately, it didn't bite me directly, getting a mouthful of jeans before I managed to kick the beast off and fly down the hillside for home. Needless to say, my first ride in the dark, alone, with barely any light, made me very apprehensive about future night rides. The next few days found me very on edge when riding home, fearful of another animal attack. Since I wasn't familiar at the time with what the typical wildlife of the area was, I was fearful of encountering Washington's larger and more aggressive predators, primarily black bears drawn to the sloughs during low tide and blackberry bushes, and, cougars. Thankfully, those nights were uneventful and overall pleasant, save for one particularly rainy night which made visibility worse. Before I continue, I feel I need to explain one aspect. Heading towards the casino along Bow Hill Road, just off Chuckanut, there's a small cattle farm which raises cows for artisanal cheeses, which, if you're ever in that area, pick some up. It's amazing. Bow Hill Road at this point twists in a weird way, snaking its way through two oddly placed plots of land, with both sides lined with thick wild brush and a small copse of trees on one side, the other with the fencing and cattle enclosure. As I was riding home, a very pleasant and bright night, a rarity in the typically overcast region I live in, my ride home was going smoothly. I'd estimate it was roughly 2 a.m. when I left work, and that since most of the ride home was just a pleasant coast down the highway, my attention was mainly on the bends in the road, and I was making sure not to drift too close to the uneven and gravelly shoulders. I had just made it down the hill and was making my way along the snaking portion as mentioned, which took me between the cattle farm and abandoned plots, maybe less than a half mile from home. And then I saw something that to this day, I can't say for certain what it was. Just as I was making the first bend, less than 50 feet ahead, I saw a large, dark brown or black furred figure stride across the 2-lane road and down into the ditch that separated the road from the cattle fence. My blood had gone cold. Just in the faint and shitty beam of my cheap flashlight, I could only make out a large torso, seen partially in profile and exposing what I can only assume was its back. I didn't see details such as the head, arms, or legs, only that the figure that moved in front of me looked roughly 8 feet tall and half that wide at what I can only assume were its shoulders. In that instant, I shouted, certain that in the moment my worst fears of a bear attack were going to happen, and that all my instincts were telling me to pedal as hard and as fast as I could. Between the shock of this figure suddenly appearing and moving in front of me and the fear of being mauled, I'm thankful I had the good sense to shout. In case you're not aware, bears, and black bears in particular, are easily spooked, and they tend to flee from humans if you make a loud noise, unless of course there's a mother bear with young nearby. Regardless, I Lance Armstronged it all the way home, grateful for the streetlights on the highway, and I managed to get home, though I ran as if I was being chased once I got off my bike until I was safely in the old farmhouse. I managed to get to my room, locked the door, and then sat on my bed, holding myself and practically hyperventilating from both exertion and fear. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to ask, did you see a Bigfoot or Sasquatch? I don't know. I truly can't say. I can tell you for certain what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear. Bears typically, if they don't stand, walk upright, and certainly not as fast as whatever it is I saw was walking. Additionally, bipedal bears walk very awkwardly, more like a waddle than something striding. It wasn't, as far as I can recall, a vagrant either. While it's true that the area does see some homeless traffic of people making their way north towards Bellingham, most of the time they travel during the day, and almost always with carts, bags, or stuff like that. The chances that what I saw being a very tall homeless man wearing a full fur jacket in August, which even that late at night wasn't cold at all, is highly unlikely. So what was it? I can't say that, but I do believe in the existence of Sasquatch. I've never been able to say definitively what I did see, only that it was large, moved fast, and made me feel very helpless and more anxious for the weeks to come until I managed to transfer to the morning shift. Whatever it was that I saw, I never experienced anything like that again, at least when it came to encountering some unknown, large, furry creature walking down the road at 2 a.m. Was it a bear? Was it Sasquatch? Was it the tallest hobo with the most unusual fashion sense? I have no idea. Even to this day, I still wonder what I saw, and if I was in any real danger. After I had shouted and booked it as fast as I could, the only sound I heard behind me was a sudden rustling of brush and a deep grunt, although in my adrenaline-fueled flight, it's possible those sounds could have been caused by a cow near the fence. But still, none of that explains whatever it was I saw that night. Hobo Witch Hunt by Vanilla Cream Dawson. I live in a small town in New England. I won't disclose what town exactly because the information I've gathered about my town is pretty controversial to say the least. I will start by telling you that in the 70s and 80s, my town used to have a heavy traffic of homeless people coming in and out. We have thick woods all around town and a generally low population, so it was the perfect combination for large colonies of homeless people from neighboring cities to gather here. Since then, the numbers have decreased, but the homeless campgrounds and older members remained up until recently. I hiked around the woods a lot as a kid and knew what areas to stay away from. Every now and then you'd run into one of these homeless people, but generally they stayed in their camps. It was September of 2008. I was 11 years old when someone from my local middle school went missing. It didn't seem like a big deal because girls her age talked of running away from home all the time. It wasn't until another girl from our high school went missing that same week that the town really started to talking. My friends stopped going out at night, and the police hung around the schools more and more. Then, in October of that year, a break-in was reported. Our police apprehended a homeless man, and news spread over town quickly because we only have about 2,000 residents, and pretty soon word got out that the hobo knew where the 2 girls were. I can remember teachers in school and my friends' parents talking about how fucked up it was that the girls could have been taken, and how they could still be alive in the woods in a camp somewhere. One night, all of my neighbors came over, and my parents told me to help my brother with his homework in another room. And as soon as I exited the kitchen, they all left in my dad's Chevy Suburban. The next day, there were no police at school, like there had been for the past month. The teachers and parents had stopped talking about the kidnappings, and everything resumed as usual. I didn't put two and two together until me and my friends stumbled upon a homeless campsite behind our local grocery store. It was wrecked. There were tents trampled, cans scattered everywhere, and dirt dug up all over the place. That day we searched every camp in town, and every one was trashed. Some looked like they'd been burned, and car tracks could be seen in the areas closer to rivers. To this day, I believe that the people in my town made raids of every camp that night. Since 2008, I haven't spotted one homeless person in the area, or in surrounding towns. Home Intruder by I Love Pussifer. This happened about 6 years ago, but first, a little backstory. Back then, I was in university and lived about 10 hours away with my parents. It was a long drive and our hometown was super boring, so I only visited for Christmas. That year, though, because I was going through a bad breakup, I went home for the summer, wanting to just be lazy and sunbathe in my parents' garden with some trashy novels. Luck was it that my cousin who lived next door, was 2 years younger than me and close to me like a sister, was also home visiting her mom. My parents had a big dog, a Cane Corso if you know the breed. It looked scary, but was a gentle giant and a surrogate mother to our kittens. Anyway, I was home for a couple of months, and my parents were going on holiday for 2 weeks on the other side of the country. I was okay being home alone, although it was a bit weird, because at this point I had been living in a big city for a few years, and was not used to everything being so quiet at night. All I could hear was crickets, and sometimes wild animals from the nearby mountains. It made it hard to sleep, so I decided to move into my parents' bedroom because they had a TV there, and I could keep it on all night for some noise. One night, my cousin came to spend the night because her mom was working the night shift and she didn't want to be home alone. So we decided to watch some horror movies and eat pizza in bed. At some point, I fell asleep, but my cousin, let's call her Anna, couldn't sleep. She was quite jumpy and easily scared, so the movies got her freaked out. I was deep asleep when she woke me up, super freaked out, and saying that someone was in the house. My mind was foggy. There was some beer with that pizza. I could barely keep my eyes open, and I told her she was being paranoid and she should go back to sleep. But she insisted there was someone in the house, and she was shaking and crying, so I was starting to worry about her. I sat up, and I heard a noise downstairs, as if someone closed the cutlery drawer in the kitchen. I flinched and put the TV on mute, and I got up and slowly locked the bedroom door and tiptoed back to bed and listened carefully. I heard the wooden floors creaking as if someone was walking around, and at this point, I was starting to join Anna in the freakout. My parents have a sensor light in the hallway. It's placed kind of in the middle of the stairs, so it will go on if someone is walking around both downstairs or upstairs. I heard the click of the light going on, and I could see the light under the bedroom door, and now I'm 100% sure someone was in the house. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the town is in the middle of fucking nowhere, and I have no service. My cousin was bawling, and I had to put a pillow over her mouth to muffle the noise, and she was holding onto the pillow and biting it to stop herself from screaming. Whoever was in the house was now climbing the stairs, and my mind was going 100 miles an hour, and I was trying to think of all possible scenarios. My best guess was that some neighbor noticed my parents' car had been gone for a few days, and they know our dog is harmless, and they know my folks are doing quite well for themselves, so maybe they're trying to find some jewelry or something. I figured if we kept quiet, they would take whatever they wanted and then go. So I told my cousin to quietly get under the bed, and I looked out the window and saw no one was on the street. Since my parents' bedroom is next to mine and mine has a balcony, I figured if push came to shove, we could climb out the window, reach the balcony, and since it's overlooking the vegetable garden, we could jump and hope the soil wouldn't break too many of our bones. As I moved to crawl under the bed, the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I froze, and I swore time stopped. My heart was beating like crazy, and I looked around, and the only weapon I could see was my mom's crochet needle in a basket by the bed. I figure I'd stabbed the sucker in the eye or something, and the doorknob rattled for a few more seconds, and then the intruder walked away. I heard whoever it was shuffling through the rest of the rooms on the floor, but I figured he or she's too quick to actually take anything. The worst thoughts crept into my head. My dad's a detective, and he worked some horrible cases involving sex trafficking rings and stuff. So what if someone was here for him? It wouldn't be the first time our family was threatened. But if that was the case, I might be dead by morning, and the thought shot adrenaline through my body. When I couldn't hear anything for a few minutes, I decided I had to get out of the room, find some cell service, and call the police. My cousin begged me to stay, but all I could think about was as if someone was after revenge. They could burn the house down with us in it or something. Also, stupid as it may sound right now, I was really worried about my dog, too. She was out there all alone, and if someone was to approach her, she probably would just lick their fingers before they shot her or something. Anyway, I took my phone, my crochet needle, and left the room. I stepped into my parents' dressing room and took my dad's baseball bat, and then made my way downstairs. The front door was wide open, and as I walked outside, I could see a man running away. I immediately called the police, and to my surprise, they told me a call was already made for that address. They were on their way. I assumed my cousin somehow called when I was gone, so I didn't question it, and the police arrived in less than a minute. It wasn't my cousin who called, and it took us a while to understand what was going on, and the officer was as confused as we were. In the end, what happened was, my neighbors were not aware I was home for the summer. They knew my parents were gone, and when they saw the lights on in the house, they started to worry. I didn't lock the door that night, and my dog had the habit of opening it with its paws and napping on the sofa downstairs. She probably opened the door at some point in the evening and then decided to go back out, and the door was left wide open. She does that a lot, and I should have known to lock the door, but I forgot. My neighbor thought someone was robbing us, so he came in, went into the kitchen to take a knife from the drawer, and then walked around to see if anyone else was in the house. He called the police at some point, and when I got out of the bedroom, he heard me, got spooked, and then ran away. So, worried neighbor who was stupid enough to go into a house while he thought it was being robbed in the middle of the night? Let's not ever meet again. Motel Ghost by Jamie. After moving to California in the late 60s, my mother and then her now late husband, Dan, decided to purchase a small motel by the beach. This motel housed approximately 20 to 40 units, as well as a small built-in house for the owners, my mom and Dan. At the time, Mom and Dan had 4 children, 2 boys, Carl and Andy, ages 15 and 2 respectively, and 2 girls, Beverly and Ann, 13 and 11. All of them lived in the house, which had plenty of space for them. The strangeness began around 6 months after moving in. Guests would sometimes complain of bad wiring, causing things like TVs and lights to come on, or of the footsteps in the room above. The wiring was quite good, as Dan was an electrician, and he would check over the wiring after the complaints. As for the noises upstairs, More often than not, they were just guests. But on occasion, they would check the registry to find that no one had been in that room, especially on the night in question. For about the next 2 years, this continued along with a few other strange things, but they were dismissible. Lost items would reappear. Doors that were supposedly locked were found open, and there were cold spots in the summer, all of which is usually explained away as the wind or a bad memory. This was Carlsbad, California, though, and in the summer it can be in the hundreds. One room, I believe it was room 22, had a habit of attracting bad people for some reason. I don't know if this had anything to do with the ghosts, but it was a room that you could count on things to be broken in by checkout time. The strange things were beginning to happen more and more often by the time Andy was 4 years old. The set occurrences seemed to happen more often, and then the real strangeness began. One morning, while Mom was fixing breakfast, Andy came wandering in sleepy-eyed and out of his room carrying something. With the usual, "Morning, honey," Mom greeted him and proceeded to ask him what he was carrying. Presenting a small tin soldier to my mom, Andy said, "The little man gave it to me, Mama." The soldier was the type that children would have played with about 100 years ago, heavy and solid. It showed signs of aging, according to my mother. She would know. She went on to own an antique shop after the motel was sold. After questioning the sleepy 4-year-old, my mother was able to find out how he had gotten the toy. He said that a little man who sat on his closet shelf gave him the toy, saying that it was a gift. This part of the story usually makes me snicker more than anything else, because my brother still claims to remember the incident clearly, and says that the man looked like a leprechaun. Well, our family is part Irish. Anyway, he claimed the man was wearing a suit and looked like a normal man, only small and kind of sparkly. There can be no doubt that the soldier existed, as it was in our family for about 8 years, and no one knows what happened to it since. As for the little man, was he real? And if so, what was he? If not, where did this antique toy come from? And that's not the end. Out in the garage of the house, Dan had a small workshop complete with a workbench and various power tools. On the top of the workbench there was an old radio, the old type from the 50s with about 5 knobs on it and a polished aluminum face. This one was just like that, but the knobs on this one had an odd way of just flying off. There was one time when Dan and Andy were both in the workshop, and they claimed to have seen the knobs hover in the air for about 30 seconds before shooting off across the room. In the workshop, oftentimes things like wrenches and saws would disappear, only to show up again a few weeks later. This place seemed to get a bit more activity than the rest of anywhere else. And one winter day, I believe it was in January, Dan was working in the shop, making a few odds and ends out of wood for around the house. He heard a voice which almost shouted, "I'm going to get you where it hurts." That left him shaken, as there was no one around to have said that, and it was not a voice he recognized. He decided to make his way into the house. Putting his tools away and walking outside, he found something that left him terrified. The grass, which had just been watered within a half hour previously, was now on fire. It was just a small patch of grass, about 2 feet square, but it had caught on fire in the perfect shape of a heart. As strange as that sounds, my entire family swears that they saw the charred grass later, and that it was shaped exactly like a heart. Dan put the fire out, and then went inside, nervous as hell. A few weeks after this happened, Dan died. He had a heart attack while at home. That was the end of the strange happenings, and things seemed to settle down a bit after his death. What happened, we might never know. But I do have one last thing to add to this story. My mother decided to find a psychic who might help her find out what had happened, and this was a few years after all of this had come to pass. What the psychic told her was that there was an old sea captain who had been buried under what was now the front steps of the motel, This had happened approximately 100 years ago, and that he was the spirit who was haunting the place. After this, my mother did research, checking public records and the like, and confirmed that a sea captain by the name given to her by the psychic did live in Carlsbad around the time, and that he had died when the psychic said he did. My mother never got the nerve up to dig up the front steps, but she believes that story. Personally, I think the psychic might have been a fake and just familiar with public records, but it's still an interesting story. She Wouldn't Go Away, submitted by Derek. So this started when I was in high school, but spanned over the following 7 years. I was a band geek in high school. I played football and baseball too, but I was really into trumpet and jazz. Still am, have my own band too. There was this girl, I'll call her Jamie for this so as to not call her out on what happened. She was cute, but more of a band geek than me. I mean, she was really smart, but that's all she did was play her flute and study. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think we all know there's more to life than just two things. I first noticed her looking at me during band practice one day. My second trumpet and I had a duo for one tune, and my band instructor wanted us to stand up during our performance, so we did that in practice too. Each time we did the solos, I would look down and see Jamie staring up at me. Totally normal, I mean, other people watched us too. But right away, this felt weird. It got to be that she looked at me so often that I finally mentioned it to my girlfriend at the time. I'll call her Chrissy. Chrissy also played the flute, but was a few chairs down from Jamie. Chris laughed at me first, but then one day she gave me a note between classes and it said, "She is looking at you a lot in band." One day, Chris came to my baseball game and so did Jamie. No big deal, right? Wrong. Jamie sat on the bleachers staring at me the whole time I was on the field. I played first base, so she was right there watching me, and any play I made, she would scream and cheer, and finally my girlfriend went over to her and told her that I was taken and to ease up a bit. Jamie sat down and didn't say anything back, and Chris was a softball player and could be intimidating when she wanted to be, and Jamie was a year younger, so there was no outbreak at the game. The staring kept up, and I started getting notes in my locker on a regular basis. It's been a long time, but I remember a lot of them said all this stuff about how my girlfriend was cheating on me and that I should dump her. I showed Chris, and she just laughed and said it was probably Jamie trying to split us up. Our prom came, and this was the night Jamie decided to tell me that she liked me. I can't remember who she went with, but during a break in dancing and stuff, I went to get a soda, and when I turned around, there she was. She asked to talk to me, and I said, "Go ahead," and she told me that she really liked me and wanted to know me better. Before I could say anything back, Chris came up and took me by the arm and just gave her a death stare. So time moved on. I went to college, and Chris and I tried to do the long-distance thing, but we ended up breaking up. However, my sophomore year, I got a little surprise. I wasn't majoring in music, but I still did play a ton and stored some of my gear in a friend's space in the music hall. Jamie, apparently, was majoring in music, and that's when I bumped into her. She went to the same college as me. It was awkward, but I tried to be nice and chatted with her for a bit, and then went on my way. And here's where things started to go off the rails. That Friday, I was at a house party, and Jamie showed up. She was with her friends, but halfway through the night, she came over to me and hung out, which was fine. But she started trying to get me to leave with her, and it got annoying. No matter where I went at that party, Jamie would find me. And finally, I told my friends I was going to head back to our dorm. I went to the bathroom and then crawled out the window and practically ran back to campus. I went to my room and then decided to take a shower, and when I got back to my room, it was pitch black as I had turned the lights off when I went down the hall. When I opened the door, light from the hallway came in, but it was still dark when I closed the door. I got a beer out of my roommate's mini fridge and went to my desk to turn on my light. When I did, what did I see? Jamie laying on my bed in just her bra and panties.
She was smiling at me, and now don't get me wrong, I like sex and chicks like there's no tomorrow, but this chick was just weird. I asked her what she was doing and how she got in, and then remembered I probably forgot to lock the door when I went for my shower. She just smiled and said, "I'm yours. Do what you want." I threw her a sweatshirt and told her that this wasn't a good idea, and she put it aside and pulled me to her. I'm just kidding. Can I sleep here, though? Honestly, some guy followed me home from the party, and I ducked into your dorm because it was closer than mine. Yeah, knowing it was a bad idea, I still let it happen. I figured I'd let her live out her little weird dream and then she'd go away. I sat in a chair despite her saying I could share my bed with her. In the morning when I woke up, she was gone. Then the phone calls started, constantly ringing for an hour at a time, usually in the middle of the night. This was in the 90s, so we had one of those old-style desk phones in our room, and my roommate Tom was getting pissed as the phone was nearest to him. Nobody was ever on the line. The phone would ring, Tom or I would answer it, and they'd hang up. Again, it was annoying, and it had to be Jamie. I started dating a girl, let's call her Kat, and every time Kat would hang out or stay overnight, the phone would ring all night long to the point that I would just have to unplug it. One night we were having sex, and in the middle of it there was a crazy pounding on my door. It startled us, and I didn't answer it, but it kept up until I finally got up and ripped the door open. There was no one there, but I did hear a stairwell door closing down the hall. This happened a lot when Kat and I were messing around. Another night, I woke up to Jamie standing in our room at like 2:30 in the morning, standing over my bed. I yelled. Tom woke up and she ran out of the room. I rarely locked our door, but Tom made me do it after that. He didn't want anyone just showing up anymore. I started getting weird letters again, and it had to be from Jamie. Some were bad poetry, and others were pictures of what I assumed was her naked from the neck or waist down. One time, she sent me a pair of her panties and a note to suck on them to taste how much she wanted me. That was it. I went to my RA, who was super cool about everything, and said he would take care of it, and he did. Jamie was barred from coming into my dorm at any time, and our RD spoke to her RD about her too. Things went quiet. I decided to transfer to another school after that year and moved to New Mexico. My mom had moved out there, and it seemed like a smart move for me, too. I grew up in Philly, and that's where I was in school before this, and just FYI. So I graduate 2 years later, and I moved to LA to work in film, which I still do. Suddenly, I started getting weird phone calls again. Lots of hang-ups and messages that said nothing but took up my entire answering machine. Then more letters. This time threatening stuff like, "Don't ignore me, answer the phone," or "You're missing out on the best pussy you'll ever get." Stuff like that. I kept all of them, and after a month of that shit, I went to the police. The problem was, none of the letters were stamped or postmarked. The cops said they were likely hand-delivered, which I found out was a crime to use a mailbox without postage. Yeah, sorry, stupid sidebar there. The police told me to change my phone number if I could, which I did, and to also let my mailman know someone was putting stuff in my mailbox illegally. Again, done and done. The calls stopped, but the letters were now just left on my car windshield. I knew it had to be Jamie again, but how the hell did she know I lived out in LA? The final straw came one night when I was admittedly a little more than tipsy. I took a cab back to my apartment after I was at a party, and I crashed on the couch after drinking a bunch of water. I woke up in the middle of the night to hear my shower running. It took me a minute to get my bearings, and then I realized that someone was in my place. My door was open just a bit, and I started freaking out. So I looked for my cordless phone, but then realized it was in my bedroom, which was next to my bathroom. I crept down the hallway to get it, and planned on calling the cops outside my front door, but I didn't get the chance. As soon as I got the phone and turned to head back to my living room, the bathroom door opened. There was Jamie, naked and soaking wet from the shower. I had to notice she was also holding a knife from my kitchen set. She smiled at me, but I didn't stick around for anything else to happen. I ran out of my apartment and called 911. Jamie followed me, saying to hang up and that she was just there to make me happy and that she'd kill herself if I didn't stop and talk to her. Like I said, I called the cops, and as luck would have it, there was a cruiser in my neighborhood and they came right over. Long story short, I waited outside. They found Jamie in my place, wearing my clothes when they got there, and she told them that I had invited her in and that I had been in love with her since high school. She told them that she was okay to be there, to which I said no fucking way, and then told them my whole story. They took her away, and that's the last I ever saw or heard from her. All I knew was that she moved back to Philly and she lives with her mother. A mutual friend said that she finally got the help that she needed. But how she knew I moved to New Mexico and then LA is still a mystery to me, and how she found out where I lived is even stranger still. I guess now that I look back on it, I don't want to know. When I was stalked, it was a long, drawn-out, years-over situation. It was my first boyfriend. We dated for maybe a year and change, a horrible relationship. He cheated, but I didn't have the self-esteem at the time to cut him loose. So it went on much longer than it should have. I broke up with him, deleted his number from my phone, and deleted most social media. I made my Facebook page private, but he would message me every day, multiple times a day, and I just wouldn't respond. He lived in the next town over, but I would see him hanging around my town, and I would see him on my way home from school. He wouldn't say anything. He would just walk parallel to me. He would look at me, but it was one of those things where you don't want to engage, but you can tell that you're being followed. So I just tried to put it out of my head, and eventually he stopped following me and the messages also stopped. So I was relieved. A couple of years later, I graduated and went to college. But then when I came back home for my first break, he started popping up again. I saw him on my block maybe once or twice, and as I said, all my social media accounts were private. But as I started to get older and applied for internships and jobs, I ended up making them public for my employers. As soon as I did, boom, he followed me. Not long after, I was up late in my room, and I heard something being thrown at my window. So I look through the window, and I see him standing in my neighbor's driveway. It's one of those things where you're aware of what's happening, but it takes you a little while to really process it. He kept coming back to my window at all hours of the night. It got to the point where I wouldn't go downstairs past a certain hour, after it got dark, because we have a big glass deck door in my kitchen. After 2 or 3 times, I told my mom, and then we called the police. At first, I didn't say anything to my mom because she was never a fan of his. It took me way longer than it should have to break up with him, and it put a strain on our relationship as a family. I didn't want to worry her or further damage our relationship as a mother and daughter by admitting what was happening to me. I was scared, but I was also scared of, I told you so. The police came and swept the area, but they didn't find anyone. They asked if he had made physical contact or threats, and because he hadn't, they said there was nothing they could do. Not long after, my mom kept telling me that the car smelled funny. It didn't stink, it just smelled different. We shared the car, so we were both pretty familiar with how it smelled inside. And then, one morning, she opened the car door, and he was sleeping in the passenger seat. We put it together that he had been sleeping in my mom's car for weeks, but I guess this one particular morning he didn't wake up in time before she left, so she caught him. She didn't even know what to say because she hadn't seen him in 3 years, and this is someone her daughter dated as a teenager, and by now I was 21. We didn't call the police. We didn't think there was anything they could do. He never made a single physical threat to us, but that doesn't mean it's not stalking. Anyway, he just got up and left, and sometime later I received a letter from him, from jail. He detailed how much I meant to him. My mom advised me to not say anything. Now, I haven't heard from him in years, thankfully. Truly, though, the aftermath has been a lot worse. A lot of me is still trying to decide if I was being irrational, even though I felt unsafe. I struggled with whether I was overreacting a lot. I get that the police can't just file restraining orders against every single person for breathing the wrong way, but it seems like there should be an in-between before it gets to actual physical contact. I remember I joked with my friend one time and said, "Hey, if I end up on a milk carton, you know who did it." And then I thought about it, and it's one of those jokes that deep down you do believe. You laugh to make light of a situation in which you feel powerless and scared, because it's all you can do. It's like a half-truth. You're actually halfway afraid that something bad is going to happen. Fear and Loathing in Paris by Laura James. On my first full day in Paris, at the start of my first solo trip overseas, I wore the one dress in my backpack and left my hair long and loose, trying not to look like a tourist, as you do. I was 22 years old and about as naive as they come. The hotel was in Montmartre, so I wandered up the streets behind the hotel towards Sacré-Cœur. I found a plaza that was full of street artists, and as I walked through, a man who was in his 40s pointed at me and yelled, "You!" As far as I could tell, I hadn't done anything wrong, but I jumped and my heart started pounding. He was trying to sell me a portrait sitting. I declined politely and tried to leave, but he was persistent. He took about 5 minutes to decide he was in love with me and that I was the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen. He followed me around with puppy dog eyes. Ah, the French. It was gross. He asked several times to be allowed to draw me, and in the end I gave in, on the condition that I wasn't buying the drawing. It took an hour to lose him. I walked the last few minutes up to Sacré-Cœur, the beautiful, blindingly white Roman Catholic church and basilica that overlooks the city. I sat on the big concrete stairs down in front of the basilica listening to a live band. It was one of those perfect moments when you arrive somewhere you've been dreaming about. Then a young guy, sitting a little way away from me, started calling and waving to me. I ignored him for a few minutes, then gave in and looked at him with an unpleasant expression on my face. He asked for a lighter. I said no. He came and sat next to me, and suddenly I had a new Klingon. He was like the street artist, in love with me after 5 minutes and frustratingly difficult to shake. In the end, I stormed off rudely. Luckily, he didn't follow. Back down on the main road that links Montmartre and Pigalle, as I headed towards a park I'd read about, I was double-teamed. When I think about it now, I imagine that the men only wanted to get me into their shop, but they went about it in very much the wrong way. One stepped in behind me, and one stood in front of me and grabbed my wrist as I tried to step past him. There was traffic streaming by, right beside the curb, and neither of the two men would let me pass. As you might imagine, I panicked. The guy holding my wrist was trying to drag me through a small doorway while I struggled like crazy. I managed to break out of his grip, glared at him in a way that probably gave him nightmares, and escaped across the road in the next gap in the traffic. After I'd been to the park, I decided to head to La Tour Eiffel, the icon of Paris. I had calmed down by the time I got there, having not been waylaid or assaulted in a good hour, and I was over the moon to be standing under one of the most recognizable monuments in the world. The man standing next to me said, "C'est grand, no?" I barely responded, but he came closer and asked again in English. I was too naive to just ignore him, so I kind of grunted. He grabbed me by the elbow and suggested a walk by the Seine, and then pulled me away. It happened so fast that by the time I started to react, he'd already got me well away from the crowd. This man told me he was Egyptian, and going by his dark skin and eyes, and by his t-shirt, which had hieroglyphics on it, that was probably true. He was about 6 feet tall, stocky and strong. Down by the river, there were a lot less people than there had been around the Eiffel Tower, and a lot fewer heavily armed police officers. I can't believe I let him take me away from right under their noses. He took me along a pathway which was away from the edge of the road, and he wouldn't let me leave. "I just need someone to talk to," he would say, but then would sit down and light a cigarette and not talk. At all. I got angry again pretty quick. After 20 minutes, I was furious. I stood up and stormed off, back in the direction we'd come from. But this guy did follow me. He grabbed my hand and didn't let go, and when I continued the charge, he yanked on my hand and stopped me. He sat me on a wooden bench and started again on the "I really, really need to talk to you" production. The cigarettes and the not talking. Within a few minutes I was off again. This time he grabbed me and told me very aggressively right into my face that we were going to a cafe. He dragged me across the road and into the nearest one. Being as green as I was, I thought the cafe would be like the ones we have in New Zealand, so I figured that I'd be able to run away while he ordered at the counter. Of course, it wasn't the same as New Zealand. He sat me at a table right next to the door, which had a pillar between it and the counter, so the staff couldn't see what was happening, and he sat beside me. Anger had turned to absolute fear, and I was shaking violently. The waiter appeared, and the man ordered an espresso, and then asked me what I wanted. I asked for lemonade. The waiter bowed and scraped and vanished. The man offered me a cigarette, and I declined. Our drinks came, and the waiter disappeared again. The street was empty, and the staff had no idea that anything was wrong when he decided he was going to kiss me. I said no. He said yes, and he was very frightening when he was angry. By now he had invited me to see Place de la Concorde and the Egyptian obelisk. He mentioned that he lived nearby, and I was so scared of what he'd do to me if he managed to get me anywhere private. I said, "Wow, I really need to go to the bathroom," in this crazy, overly upbeat voice that didn't even sound like my own. So, get this, he stood up and took me to the bathroom. I locked myself in for a few minutes, and I don't remember even being able to think. I was so scared. Eventually, I unlocked the door and crept out, and here's where my luck finally turned. He'd gone back to the table behind the pillar, and he couldn't see me. The bathroom was downstairs, so I hovered on the stairs, crouched against the wall, and the first person to walk by was one of the waiters. My French, despite all the years of lessons, never really got very good, so I flagged the waiter down and asked him, "Parlez-vous anglais?" He said no. At that moment, I thought I was a goner. L'homme jabbed my finger towards the table I'd been sitting at. Il... And right there, I ran out of words. So I grabbed my right wrist with my left hand tight and shook it at the waiter. He gaped first at my hands and then at my face. He signaled me to follow and took me through a corridor to the back door, which happened to be right next to the front door. The waiter said, "I open door. You," and I filled in, "I'll run." He looked at me and then pushed the door open. I had never run so hard or so fast in my life. I heard a man yell behind me, but I didn't even slow down. I turned the first corner I came to, then the next, and then the next in random directions. Somehow, I wound up back at the Eiffel Tower. Now, of course, the men with the huge guns took notice. They grouped together and stared hard at me as I ran towards them. There was no way my French could stand up to an inquisition from the police, and being shot would have really just capped my day off. So for the first time since I left the cafe, I stopped running and looked behind me. I walked past the first group of officers trying to haul air into my lungs. Then I stopped, pulled out my map, and found the nearest metro station. The 45-minute trip back to my hotel was terrifying, particularly when I had to change lines at the Place de la Concorde stop. I was too scared to leave my hotel room for about 24 hours. Since then, I'm probably too cautious about talking to people, and I tend to blank most people who speak to me when I'm alone. I traveled for another 3 months without any more incidents as bad as this, and have since had another 2 solo trips. I've been back to Paris, and even to the Eiffel Tower, although I certainly didn't go alone. Take it from me, be wary of strangers. Driven by Demons by Richard Oldale. If you're thinking of hiring a car in the Andean region, think again. In fact, forget the idea completely. Driving in Bolivia and Peru is an accident waiting to happen. Most already have. All cars have dents, broken taillights, or a swinging wing mirror. Those that don't are fresh off the production line. Drivers flood the roads like shoals of fish, and most of them use it as a racetrack. There are no laws to speak of, just unwritten rules locals have invented over time. And cars drive on both sides of the road, seriously. The correct side is on the right, but if there are fewer potholes on the left, so be it. Drivers approaching crossroads and city centers beep their horns to warn traffic coming from another direction they are approaching, and most are not willing to stop. Especially taxi drivers. In the Andes, the taxi driver is king of the road. Nobody is allowed to overtake him. Anybody with the audacity to even attempt it is shut out, given a demonic stare, and beeped at frantically. Taxi drivers use their horn more than any other driver, and climbing into an Andean cab is putting your life in the hands of Latino testosterone. Of course, I knew none of this before embarking on a journey up a windy mountain road in a colectivo, a minibus, to the ancient site of El Fuerte. The final destination of the bus is Saimaipata, which is where the elite of Santa Cruz chose to build their elegantly designed 2-story, eco-friendly houses with ornate gardens brimming with tropical plants. Winding up the mountainside, the taxi teeters perilously close to the edge, so close I can see cragged rocks jutting out beneath us. Further down the steep valleys, sloping hills fold into a blend of patchwork greens, some so bright it could be kryptonite. The area is also prone to landslides, and the thought of us crashing down the crevasse like a falling rock naturally crosses my mind. Along the side of the road, stone barriers packed into wire meshing have been erected to combat the problem of mountain debris blocking the roads. Smooth roads end abruptly, and all of a sudden the minibus is rattling around in potholes. I'm thrown out of my seat and smash my head on the bar above me, so that's why it's wrapped with pipe insulation. Another taxi heads directly towards us as he overtakes a minion. For once, our taxi driver releases his foot from the accelerator, but is quick to sound his horn. After wandering around the ruins for 2 hours, we return to the entrance to find our taxi driver leaning against the door of his car with his arms folded. He seems impatient to get back on the road, but when he sees us, he smirks with the look of a demon. We rattle back down the dirt track and back along the winding mountain road. It's getting dark, and the journey home is even more of a white-knuckle ride. The taxi driver shows his intention to overtake the car in front by riding his bumper, flashing his headlights and sounding his horn, naturally. The minion knows his place and moves over, allowing us to pass. As wild horses and donkeys feast peacefully on tufts of grass by the roadside, we uncomfortably head straight towards another set of blazing headlights of oncoming traffic. We swerve from one side of the road to the other, fending off traffic amidst a constant sounding of horns. By now, the familiar demonic stare was firmly fixed on our driver's face. A young, skinny dog no older than 3 was eating in the middle of the road. As the taxi driver risks our lives with another crazy overtake, we hurtle towards this dog. He looks up from his food, but doesn't move. He doesn't panic. He has nowhere to go, so stands his ground and accepts apparent death. I hold my breath. A girl behind me gasps. We are within inches of the dog when the taxi driver swerves and almost takes the minion car out. In the rearview mirror, I see a smile part the driver's lips. His demon eyes look for a reaction from his passengers. We continue to zigzag through the traffic, not giving an inch and stealing a yard at every given opportunity. Somehow, we arrive back in Santa Cruz unscathed. Back at the hotel, my legs a little weak, I asked the receptionist whether the horn beeps are signals or just a noise. They're supposed to be signals, he tells me, but there are so many people sounding their horns, nobody really knows what they mean.
This event had happened to me in the late summer of 2011, early August if memory serves. At that time in my life, I was living in a small town in northwest Washington called Bow Edison, a rural community south of Bellingham, north of Burlington Sedro-Woolley, and that was off of the Chickenut Drive Highway. It's easily one of the most beautiful spots to visit. Bow Edison is essentially two small villages which overlap one another, with Bow being somewhat sparse and dotting the landscape with isolated farming homes, and Edison a bit of a hub village. They both exist in an intersecting location, geographically speaking. In a matter of minutes, you'll pass through flat farmland, hilly forests, rocky and densely wooded mountains, and oceanfront property. I had recently completed a year at trade school, attending the Job Corps program at Sedro-Woolley, and had just gotten my first job for the Skagit Valley Casino and Resort. Sadly, I didn't have many finances, only enough to cover rent for a room in an old farmhouse just off of Chuckanut. This was lucky for me, as it was only a few miles from the casino, which was just off the Interstate 5 and was a more than feasible ride on the hand-me-down bike I had procured shortly before graduating Job Corps. When I started, I was a dishwasher, and one that worked the swing or night shift. Getting to work was a bit of a pain. The ride was mostly uphill and along the windy Bow Hill Road, but over time it became manageable. I had just moved into the farmhouse and was starting my second week when I had first come to regret taking the night shift. Sadly, at this time, I only had a cheap gas station flashlight to illuminate my ride, which at night was made even darker since Bow Hill Road cut through dense forested areas and had several twists and bends, and it made the whole ride harrowing in some instances. My first ride home at around 3 in the morning hadn't gone well. Within minutes of departure, I had been attacked by an animal which darted out of the underbrush and tried biting at my right leg. I didn't see what precisely lunged out at me, though in hindsight I'm certain it was a coyote or a stray dog. Fortunately, it didn't bite me directly, getting a mouthful of jeans before I managed to kick the beast off and fly down the hillside for home. Needless to say, my first ride in the dark, alone, with barely any light, made me very apprehensive about future night rides. The next few days found me very on edge when riding home, fearful of another animal attack. Since I wasn't familiar at the time with what the typical wildlife of the area was, I was fearful of encountering Washington's larger and more aggressive predators, primarily black bears drawn to the sloughs during low tide and blackberry bushes, and, cougars. Thankfully, those nights were uneventful and overall pleasant, save for one particularly rainy night which made visibility worse. Before I continue, I feel I need to explain one aspect. Heading towards the casino along Bow Hill Road, just off Chuckanut, there's a small cattle farm which raises cows for artisanal cheeses, which, if you're ever in that area, pick some up. It's amazing. Bow Hill Road at this point twists in a weird way, snaking its way through two oddly placed plots of land, with both sides lined with thick wild brush and a small copse of trees on one side, the other with the fencing and cattle enclosure. As I was riding home, a very pleasant and bright night, a rarity in the typically overcast region I live in, my ride home was going smoothly. I'd estimate it was roughly 2 a.m. when I left work, and that since most of the ride home was just a pleasant coast down the highway, my attention was mainly on the bends in the road, and I was making sure not to drift too close to the uneven and gravelly shoulders. I had just made it down the hill and was making my way along the snaking portion as mentioned, which took me between the cattle farm and abandoned plots, maybe less than a half mile from home. And then I saw something that to this day, I can't say for certain what it was. Just as I was making the first bend, less than 50 feet ahead, I saw a large, dark brown or black furred figure stride across the 2-lane road and down into the ditch that separated the road from the cattle fence. My blood had gone cold. Just in the faint and shitty beam of my cheap flashlight, I could only make out a large torso, seen partially in profile and exposing what I can only assume was its back. I didn't see details such as the head, arms, or legs, only that the figure that moved in front of me looked roughly 8 feet tall and half that wide at what I can only assume were its shoulders. In that instant, I shouted, certain that in the moment my worst fears of a bear attack were going to happen, and that all my instincts were telling me to pedal as hard and as fast as I could. Between the shock of this figure suddenly appearing and moving in front of me and the fear of being mauled, I'm thankful I had the good sense to shout. In case you're not aware, bears, and black bears in particular, are easily spooked, and they tend to flee from humans if you make a loud noise, unless of course there's a mother bear with young nearby. Regardless, I Lance Armstronged it all the way home, grateful for the streetlights on the highway, and I managed to get home, though I ran as if I was being chased once I got off my bike until I was safely in the old farmhouse. I managed to get to my room, locked the door, and then sat on my bed, holding myself and practically hyperventilating from both exertion and fear. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to ask, did you see a Bigfoot or Sasquatch? I don't know. I truly can't say. I can tell you for certain what it wasn't. It wasn't a bear. Bears typically, if they don't stand, walk upright, and certainly not as fast as whatever it is I saw was walking. Additionally, bipedal bears walk very awkwardly, more like a waddle than something striding. It wasn't, as far as I can recall, a vagrant either. While it's true that the area does see some homeless traffic of people making their way north towards Bellingham, most of the time they travel during the day, and almost always with carts, bags, or stuff like that. The chances that what I saw being a very tall homeless man wearing a full fur jacket in August, which even that late at night wasn't cold at all, is highly unlikely. So what was it? I can't say that, but I do believe in the existence of Sasquatch. I've never been able to say definitively what I did see, only that it was large, moved fast, and made me feel very helpless and more anxious for the weeks to come until I managed to transfer to the morning shift. Whatever it was that I saw, I never experienced anything like that again, at least when it came to encountering some unknown, large, furry creature walking down the road at 2 a.m. Was it a bear? Was it Sasquatch? Was it the tallest hobo with the most unusual fashion sense? I have no idea. Even to this day, I still wonder what I saw, and if I was in any real danger. After I had shouted and booked it as fast as I could, the only sound I heard behind me was a sudden rustling of brush and a deep grunt, although in my adrenaline-fueled flight, it's possible those sounds could have been caused by a cow near the fence. But still, none of that explains whatever it was I saw that night. Hobo Witch Hunt by Vanilla Cream Dawson. I live in a small town in New England. I won't disclose what town exactly because the information I've gathered about my town is pretty controversial to say the least. I will start by telling you that in the 70s and 80s, my town used to have a heavy traffic of homeless people coming in and out. We have thick woods all around town and a generally low population, so it was the perfect combination for large colonies of homeless people from neighboring cities to gather here. Since then, the numbers have decreased, but the homeless campgrounds and older members remained up until recently. I hiked around the woods a lot as a kid and knew what areas to stay away from. Every now and then you'd run into one of these homeless people, but generally they stayed in their camps. It was September of 2008. I was 11 years old when someone from my local middle school went missing. It didn't seem like a big deal because girls her age talked of running away from home all the time. It wasn't until another girl from our high school went missing that same week that the town really started to talking. My friends stopped going out at night, and the police hung around the schools more and more. Then, in October of that year, a break-in was reported. Our police apprehended a homeless man, and news spread over town quickly because we only have about 2,000 residents, and pretty soon word got out that the hobo knew where the 2 girls were. I can remember teachers in school and my friends' parents talking about how fucked up it was that the girls could have been taken, and how they could still be alive in the woods in a camp somewhere. One night, all of my neighbors came over, and my parents told me to help my brother with his homework in another room. And as soon as I exited the kitchen, they all left in my dad's Chevy Suburban. The next day, there were no police at school, like there had been for the past month. The teachers and parents had stopped talking about the kidnappings, and everything resumed as usual. I didn't put two and two together until me and my friends stumbled upon a homeless campsite behind our local grocery store. It was wrecked. There were tents trampled, cans scattered everywhere, and dirt dug up all over the place. That day we searched every camp in town, and every one was trashed. Some looked like they'd been burned, and car tracks could be seen in the areas closer to rivers. To this day, I believe that the people in my town made raids of every camp that night. Since 2008, I haven't spotted one homeless person in the area, or in surrounding towns.
Whispering Spirit Under the Bed by Bo Bandy. In 1988, I rented an old wooden house with my then wife. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a very creepy noise which would alternate from a loud, irregular chanting to an almost whisper-like, eerie hiss. It was like nothing I'd ever heard. The hair on the back of my non-believer neck stood completely on end. Frankly, I was freaking the F out and questioning my denial of the supernatural. I urgently woke up my wife, but communicated for her to say nothing and just listen. I wanted to make sure I wasn't imagining the whole thing or dreaming. In just a few seconds, her eyes grew as large as saucers, and I received my answer. She clearly heard it too, and was so terrified that she wasn't even able to speak at first. Finally, she summoned the courage to whisper to me, "What is that?" I shook my head in bewilderment. I had no explanation to give. The inhuman whisper didn't seem to be bothered at all by our awareness of it, and only the thundering beat of my heart partially drowned it out. It was very close to us. It sounded like it was less than 3 feet away, and as the man of the house, I was expected to investigate what it was. The hiss was actually coming from underneath our bed, specifically directly under my side. I didn't have a bedside table or lamp, so the only way to turn on a light was for me to get up and walk over to the wall switch in the dark. You can probably understand why I was hesitant to do that. A little light did filter in from the streetlight across the road through our curtained windows, but it wasn't very much, and not nearly enough to make me feel brave enough to investigate. Worse still, the ungodly whispering continued on, unabated. With courage, I finally dredged up from somewhere I'll never know. I leaned over and peered underneath the bed to confront the unknown source of our terror. Slowly, my eyes adjusted to the near-total darkness under the bed, and I made out what was haunting us. Each night we carried a glass jug of water to bed with us, so we didn't have to get up and go to the kitchen for a drink. One of those half-gallon-sized orange juice jars with a metal lid. I quickly surmised that the hiss and chanting was actually coming from that darn possessed jug. The metal lid wasn't screwed on completely, and trapped air was escaping out of the partially screwed-on lid. After realizing that our chanting ghost was actually just escaping air from a water jug, we had a good laugh, but it made me realize how brittle my disbeliever courage was. Less than a month later, I found myself with a nearly identical repeat of the situation, except I knew for a fact that we hadn't brought the water jug to bed with us. And this time the hissing was different, and sounded like a feral animal on the attack. Note, we didn't have any pets. Again, I awoke with my wife. She listened and heard the same close-by screeching, hissing noise that I did, and I didn't have to remind her that we left the water jug in the fridge. She remembered that too. We both stared at each other in the dark. The noise was angry and threatening. It was almost like a series of guttural growls and fiery hissing. This time it seemed to be a little farther away than the first time, but still incredibly close. I pulled back the curtain and looked outside. Nothing. My heart was racing. It was definitely coming from right outside the window, and yet there was nothing I could see out there. The street light lit up the yard well enough to see even our individual blades of grass, and yet the unexplained hissing continued. Finally, I stood up and put my face against the glass. When I peered down as sharply as I could, I was able to solve this mystery. 2 or 3 cats had cornered an opossum, and they were all having a hissing match near the side of the house. Only by directly looking down at an acute angle could I see them. In the dark, in the sterile stillness of the night, little unexplained things can seem like big unexplained things. Candace from Uber by Yearn to Learn. Although it sounds logical, always make sure that your rideshare is the vehicle on the profile you are paired with. Don't get into an unauthorized vehicle or with an unauthorized driver. If you're suspicious, call the company. Make sure the child lock is disabled if you can. My girlfriend recently was taking an Uber from my apartment to the Greyhound station because I wasn't feeling well enough to drive her to the station myself. She was paired with a woman named Jade who would arrive in a Ford Focus according to the Uber app. What showed up was a 6'3", 220-pound man in a new 4-door tan Cadillac, the sedan model. Neither of us were able to get the plate number, unfortunately. He had a short haircut and a tightly cropped beard, wearing a black pea coat. He looked like a typical enforcer type. I walked my girlfriend downstairs and then headed back into our apartment, and the car was right outside. She goes out and doesn't see a Ford Focus. She sees the Cadillac. The man starts honking and gets out to shout "Uber" and tells her to get in. She hesitated and began to walk away, back towards the building, and he began to get out of the car and command her to get into the vehicle. She's at the side door near the dumpster and can't find her keys. She's frantically calling me to come let her in, and the doors of our apartment complex on both the front and side entrances lock behind you. Once I let her in, she started shivering and crying hysterically. She told me that the man got out of the car and followed her to the door. Somehow I got there just in time to let her in. Once we were inside our apartment, I locked the door behind us, not that it made all that much of a difference, considering he was locked out of the entrance. Then she started getting calls from a blocked number. She kept declining the call, and after the 10th time, I picked up and asked who it was. The guy claimed to be an Uber driver and that she needed to complete the ride or the app wouldn't let him leave. Uber was new to the area at the time, so whatever ring he was part of probably got a few uninformed people like us. I told him that's not how it works, canceled the ride and told him to leave. He kept insisting. I hung up and we got 12 more calls. I picked up again, this time in the most eerily fake female voice I've ever heard. The caller said, "Candace from Uber." It still gives me shivers thinking about that conversation. Candace said,
"This is Candace from Uber. We have a report of a female passenger refusing to get into a vehicle. She needs to get into the vehicle right now."
I demanded to speak to a manager and was told there wasn't one on the floor. I said, "Fine, put me on with any other coworker." I heard someone clear their throat, and this time a different male voice than the driver came on. He immediately knew the situation somehow and said the same thing that Candace did. I told them that they needed to tell the car outside the apartment to leave immediately or I was calling the cops. They insisted that she get into the car again, so I just hung up. We went out of the other exit to our building and I drove her myself. By the time I got back to the apartment, he was still outside. That's when I saw him well enough to give the description I did. Naturally, she reported it to Uber, and I gave the police a statement. I took a Lyft the next morning and told the driver on a whim. The driver confirmed the same thing happened with his girlfriend. Same guy, same tan Cadillac. However, he was with his girlfriend in the Uber. My Lyft driver asked him why his profile was incorrect, and the driver told him that the app makes mistakes sometimes. Suspecting something was up, his girlfriend texted him while he was in the car saying that she was afraid. My driver actually showed me the texts too. It was so bizarre. He also noted that there was a huge roll of saran wrap in the guy's back seat. Please, make sure you're safe in your rideshare. Verify it's the correct vehicle and driver, and do not get into the car with an unauthorized driver or vehicle. Make sure the child lock is disabled too, please. I couldn't imagine if something happened to my girlfriend. Be safe. I was abducted by My Throwaway 999. This happened to me from age 6 through about my mid-30s. My first encounter was around age 6, and I woke up to what you would call a gray in a shared bedroom with my 2 siblings who slept through it. I startled the creature, and it glided or ran down the hallway and then ran through my parents' closed bedroom door. I opened the door, and it wasn't in the room. It had vanished. Nobody else saw this encounter. I had many additional encounters in the years to follow, too, and I've never spoken publicly for fear of ridicule. Through my teenage years, I don't remember any specific events, but the next specific memories were around age 25 when I moved into a third-floor apartment, the top floor. I remember the sound of the tiny shuffling feet coming down the hallway, and then being completely unable to move. They came into my room and surrounded my bed. 4 or 5 smaller grays and then 1 or 2 taller ones who seemed to be directing the operation. There was no verbal interaction, but they made a sound like a clicking noise, which I assumed was them speaking to one another. They would touch a metal rod to my shoulder, and I would black out. Usually, I would wake up about 8 or 10 hours later, and sometimes as much as 24 hours later. Once, I woke up locked outside on my back porch in my underwear at 2 in the morning, with no memory of what happened during that time. So my reaction at the time was of course terror, but also anger. I wanted to catch these buggers in the act, so I set up IR alarms that would make a loud noise if anyone walked through the beam, and they were never triggered. One time, I strung a wire at ankle level across the hallway to trip anyone that didn't know it was there. I heard the shuffling feet approaching, then the sound of 5 or 6 creatures tumbling and falling on top of each other. A few seconds later, they burst into my room, and they were pissed off. Zapped me unconscious immediately. Even now, I'm trying to remember everything as I type this. For a while, I was in a support group online, and we shared abduction stories. But other than that, I haven't spoken about this publicly, even to my wife. Around age 30, I moved out of my apartment and back into my parents' house, some financial issues, and I thought the encounters would stop. They didn't, but they did change quite a bit. At my parents' house, I was in a room on the first floor, and everyone else was upstairs. There were hardwood floors in the upstairs, and almost immediately upon moving back home in the middle of the night, I was awoken by the sound of what sounded like dozens of clawed feet shuffling on the wooden floors. At the same time, an eerie blue light filled the house, shining under the closed door, and there was a weird electrical buzzing sound. I remember the first time this happened, I reached for the door, and it was like someone shouting in my head, "Go to sleep!" I went immediately to sleep, and I don't recall anything after that. But I do recall numerous additional times when I woke to one or more of them standing over my bed, or just waking up to the blue light, but nothing specific. A few years later, I'm guessing around my mid-30s, I got my act together and moved back out. I rented the second floor of a house, and another guy had the third floor. We shared a first-floor kitchen and common area, and again I have numerous recollections of waking up to a blue light filling the room, and occasionally seeing them standing over me. Somewhere in this period, I believe they may have placed an implant in my leg. I woke up with an unexplained scar, and all the hair shaved from one shin. About a year later, I woke up to them standing around me, and remember the thought was projected to me, "We're going to take it out now," and then I went unconscious. My upstairs roommate commented me that one time he woke up and walked past my closed door, and he confirmed there was a blue light coming out from the edges of my door. A Horrifying, Unforgettable Week by Polexia. I'd moved to Texas to live with my mom during my first pregnancy, since I had no support system in my hometown. I lived with her for about a year before the issues started up. It was around 9 o'clock at night, and my mom, stepfather, and I were at the dining room table, and I had my 6-month-old son on my lap. He was refusing to sleep, and I didn't want to wake up my step-siblings by fussing loudly in my room, which was across the hall from the kids' rooms, and he was a very loud child when he was unhappy. So I figured him being with me would help him calm down enough to sleep. All of a sudden, he just froze in my lap, stiff as a board, and stared at the corner of the living room. I noticed he wasn't fidgeting anymore and followed his gaze, but nothing was there. It was just an empty corner. I got my mom's attention, and she looked at the corner as well, but she didn't see anything there either. My 6-month-old son started pointing at the corner, crying quietly, and my mom walked across the room, ran her hand around the corner but felt nothing, and came back. Within moments, my son stopped staring and leaned against my chest, falling asleep in just a few minutes. I laid him down in his crib, turned on some music, and left him there until I was ready to go to bed myself. I thought nothing of the shadows I saw moving in the hall through the crack between the bottom of my door and the floor, assuming they were just my stepfather checking in on his kids. 2 days later, it happened again, but this time my son's crying wasn't quiet. My mom checked the corner, and my son finally fell asleep, still sniffling, and I put him to bed. I went out onto the back deck for a cigarette around 10:30 before I headed for bed, and when I came back inside, my stepfather, we'll call him Dale, stopped me and said, "He's okay, but who's that woman?" "What woman?" I asked, because I couldn't see anyone near my room, and there were no new photos on the walls. "The woman there, in front of your door. She's got short curly hair. She's short of sort and skinny, wearing a button-down shirt and a long jean skirt." "Dale," I said, "you drunk? There's no one there." But I did know that description. It was exactly how my grandmother looked when she was younger, and he had never met her. She died almost 2 years before this point, and I chalked it up to him, as I said, being drunk and maybe remembering a description my mother might have told him. The next 3 nights went much the same. We lost the house within the next month due to my stepfather not being able to work because of a car accident, so my mom and Dale took the kids an hour and a half away to stay with Dale's parents, while my son and I stayed behind to finish packing up the house. It was the easiest for all of us. Mom and Dale could focus on the kids and finding a new place, and I could focus on my son and packing without having to deal with the fuss that comes with 3 kids all close in age and reaching the point where they rarely got along. The first night was fine. I got the kids' belongings in boxes, and half of my room was organized and ready to be packed. The second evening is when it started. I had just laid my son down in bed, gotten the Disney station started up for him, and shut the door behind me when I heard the whispering. I opened my door again, but all I could hear was colors of the wind. The whispering got louder when I reached the living room. It seemed to come from what was my mom's room, and I hurriedly shut the door, turned on Alfred Hitchcock Presents on the television, and forced myself to focus on packing things up. I eventually fell asleep on the couch around 1 a.m. The next night, I was smoking before bed and on the phone with my friend, we'll call Brian, talking about nothing in particular. I fell silent as I realized there were 4 dark figures standing in the backyard, halfway between the deck and the back fence. They didn't move at all, but they were there. I took a picture on my phone, but the phone didn't show anything. I went inside, made sure all doors and windows were locked, and broke my own rule of smoking in the house. I didn't go back outside until the sun was up, and once I finally fell asleep, it didn't last long. I woke up to the feeling of someone watching me, and the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up, and goosebumps all over my body. The music came the following night. Big band, 50s-style music, crackling and fluctuating in volume and eerily haunting, coming from my mom's room. My son wouldn't sleep in our room, screeching every time I tried to lay him down, so I made him a bed of extra comforters in the living room floor. He was asleep within minutes. I ignored the music as much as I could, but it was difficult. It played for 3 hours before suddenly cutting off, leaving the house in silence. But the figures in the backyard were there again. The 5th night I stayed in that house alone was also the final night. I'd become accustomed to the haunting strains of old music, the terrifying shadows in the backyard, the faint whispering, even the feeling of something being in the house with my son and me. But nothing could ever have prepared me for what happened that final night. I made sure the dishes were washed and put away, laundry run through the machines, folded and put away in boxes, and the trash was bagged up and ready to be put in the cans outside. I fell asleep to the sound of Alfred Hitchcock talking on the TV, the 50s music coming from my mom's room, and soft voices speaking too fast and too quietly for me to understand. I woke up in less than 2 hours, unable to breathe. It felt like I was being strangled, thick fingers around my throat, and a harsh, growling breathing in my ears. I was sobbing, my son was screaming, and I couldn't move. The sensation was gone as suddenly as it had come, and I stumbled to my feet, picked up my son to comfort him, and headed into the kitchen for a drink. I know I had put away every single dish and piece of silverware because I sent my mom a picture when I was done with the caption of, "See, Mom, I'm not being lazy." But there, on the island counter, was our largest butcher knife, and as I stared at it, it started almost vibrating, wiggling across the countertop before rising about an inch in the air. I screamed and ran back into the living room, stuffing my son rather haphazardly into his car seat before returning to my room to gather up clothes and drag his mattress from the crib. I shoved bottles and formula and diapers and wipes into a large duffel bag, the clothes into my book bag, and left it by the door while I ran my son out to the car as a guttural laugh echoed throughout the house. I nearly wrecked the car trying to reverse out of the driveway. I called my mom as I drove towards where they were staying, asking for directions and crying too hard to explain what happened. My phone died before I was even halfway there. Dale's mom didn't believe me when I got there, but I know Mom and Dale did. They'd seen the benevolent stuff, the less frightening occurrences, and so it wasn't a far leap from just presences to what I experienced that night. When I went to show them the pictures and let them listen to the audio of the music from their room, everything was gone. I mean, not just deleted or silent audio clips. The data wasn't there at all. The last I heard, the people who moved in after us left the house in just as much of a hurry as I did that night, and the neighbor across the street went in to clean it up and probably take things that were left behind, but couldn't even get past the front door before she felt like she was being strangled. Now the land has an enormous crack through it, and the house was in ruins for over a year before the city decided to tear it down. I've had rather strange experiences in my life. I'm 17 now and have never really been too scared by anything that's happened to me. I grew up in an older trailer park, so as young as 8, friends and I would go around with tape recorders trying to explain the weird things that would happen to us. On one occasion, we even had some heavy metal pliers thrown at us from across the room several times, and each time the pliers fell 2 inches from our feet and were always facing the same direction. Needless to say, the paranormal isn't a new thing for me. I've lived with my grandmother in the same apartment for about 3 years, and it's an older apartment building, and it's for people over 62, so it's very common for people to pass away in the building. I can live there because my grandmother has legal custody of me, by the way. One night, I was on the couch and saw a human figure crouching suddenly run from one end of the room to the other and leave through the wall. The figure was all black and crossed right in front of me. I often see similar shadow figures standing near the dining room table at night when I get a snack. The really interesting thing about these at-night experiences, though, is that my cat will usually follow me when he hears my door open, and every time he sees something, he arches his back and hisses. It's the only time he ever hisses. These experiences have never really bothered me, since they seem to pay me no mind. But the first experience that made me start thinking a little differently happened to me about 7 months ago. I was home alone with my cat in the middle of the afternoon, which is a pretty common occurrence for me, and why I think I have so many more experiences than my grandmother or my mom, who often stays for the weekend. I like to keep my lamp unplugged when it isn't on and leave the switch on, so I just plug it in and unplug it. I was in the kitchen that afternoon when my doorknob unlatched, swung open, and slammed shut. When I went to investigate, I found my lamp had been plugged in. No windows were open, and the door is rather difficult to open anyways because the knob is messed up. When I told my grandmother about it, she was very skeptical, but we couldn't find any reasonable explanation. Just a few weeks later, I woke up at about 3 a.m. to my closet door repeatedly sliding open and closed. It wouldn't stop, and it went on for about 20 minutes, and I ended up sleeping in the living room. That hasn't happened since. Things calmed down for a few months, except for an occasional shadowy figure, actually seen by my mom one time. But everything started ramping up in ways I've never had to deal with. One thing that really frightened me happened about 2 weeks ago. I was taking a shower, and when I turned the water off to get out, the shower curtain opened all the way by itself. There was an indent in the curtain about 4 feet off the floor, like a hand pulling it. There was no figure I could see, but it was one of the first truly terrifying experiences I've ever had. I was home alone at the time and refused to go back in the bathroom until my grandma came home about 4 hours later. Then, exactly a week ago, I was in the bathroom around 3 a.m. with my cat when we heard someone pacing outside the door. I say we because my cat became very alert. We heard the trash can being used, and then we heard it right outside the door. The knob started turning, and I said, "Wait a minute, someone's in here," because I thought maybe it was my grandma. I opened the door, and there was nothing there. And even my cat kept looking around, trying to find something. My grandma was asleep. I could hear the same footsteps outside of my closed door until I finally fell asleep. And most recently, last night, I was again in the bathroom around 3 a.m. I heard footsteps come from my grandma's room to outside the door, and the knob started turning, and again I said someone was in there. But this time, the knob kept wiggling for a few seconds until the door swung open, with no sign of anyone there. These past 3 experiences are really the only ones in my life that have been particularly disturbing. I don't know if this is something, just wanting attention, or perhaps some sort of poltergeist. My mother thinks I may be more sensitive to these things since I have so many experiences. My grandmother is no longer skeptical about the weird things that have happened to me. Any thoughts on the matter would be greatly appreciated. There's this little girl who lives in our neighborhood who says the most disturbing shit on a regular basis. She's very creepy and is always talking to herself. One day, the neighbor texted me and asked if I could watch her little girl while she took the older boys to the doctor. And of course, I didn't mind. The boys were sick. So the little girl comes over, and I tell her she can watch TV or go downstairs to play in the craft room, which was just basically a room full of yarn and fabric with a quilting table in it. I mean, nothing breakable or dangerous. And she chose the craft room. She was down there playing with her dolls and talking the entire time, and I can see straight into the basement and hear her perfectly from the kitchen. That's where I am, making birthday pies for a friend, and I was starting to listen to what she was saying. She was having a really weird conversation, saying things like, "Well, my mom doesn't go to church either," and "People think God is fake, like my mommy's friends," and "Church shoes hurt my feet. Maybe that's why she doesn't go." So I go downstairs and ask who she's talking to, and the conversation goes something like this. Me: "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" Neighborhood kid: "The priest who lives here." Me: "What priest? I'm not a priest." Kid: "Girls can't be priests." Me: "Well, that's very true, but," insert my husband's name in here, "and my father-in-law aren't priests." Neighborhood kid: "I know," insert my husband's name here again, "he makes swords. A priest lives here too." Me: "No, the priests and penguins live in another house, down the street." Neighbor's kid says, "Nope, one still lives here." Me: "Sweetheart, people from the church live down the street, not here." The neighbor's kid says, "You don't know who's in your house all the time with you, do you?" Okay. At this point, I just go back upstairs because I feel foolish for arguing with a small child, and she's freaking me out a little bit. I don't even mention this to her or anyone else. We find out about 2 months after this that our house had been at one time owned by the church about 80 years ago and was sold to private owners about 60 years ago. I know she could have overheard someone saying something about our house, or she could have been playing a child's game, or any number of other solutions. However, this kid is always saying shit like this. This is not an isolated incident. According to my mother-in-law, she was over here the other day and said something like, "Your grandma thinks so-and-so is too nosy." And my mother-in-law said, "Honey, my grandmother is dead." And this kid poker-faced it up and said, "I know," and walked away. Yesterday she was over here playing in our yard, and she asked me if I had said anything bad about a certain man. When I said no and asked why she would ask me that, she got up from her swing and said, "The man who follows you looks mad at you. Also, his bird is gone." And then, as casually as she can say, she says, "Can you help me weed your garden?" Also, things go missing if she comes near our house. I mean, she doesn't even have to come into our home. She just has to be on the property. We'll all be searching for things like keys and books, wallets, coats, shoes, everything for days, sometimes weeks. This girl is weird.
So this happened back in 2000 when I was 15 years old, when smartphones and regular mobile phones were scarce. It was a Friday night, and the sky was as clear as I could remember, and the full moon was shining in the sky, and the saying that, "If the full moon is out, the crazies come out," was playing in my mind as I looked up. I was doing my usual Friday night routine, which involved being out with a group of my friends at the local park, about 1.5 miles from my parents' house. This park was located next to a densely wooded area, and going through this wooded area would be my most direct route home, as it had a footpath that went straight through the middle of it. It was starting to get late, and a few of my friends had already left, and it wasn't long until I decided that it was time for me to leave too, so I headed home. I would normally take the footpath directly through the woods. It had lighting at the entrance and exit, but nothing throughout it, so it was pretty dark. For some reason, I felt uneasy about walking through the woods that night, so I decided to take the long route around the woods. To be fair, that wasn't unnormal for me. I would occasionally take the long route in fear of something being in the darkness on the path. As I walked through the empty streets, I noticed they seemed very quiet, eerily quiet, in fact. I continued to walk until I reached an alleyway on my left, which was a cut-through to another street, and I looked up the alleyway as I walked past, and that's where I saw him, a large, dark-hooded figure at the other end. I could barely see his face, but I knew he was staring directly at me. I could feel his eyes burning right through me, and I started to get a horrible feeling. My stomach was knotting, so I continued walking at a faster pace. Once I got past the alleyway's entrance, and he was out of sight, I heard a sound that horrified me. The sound of running echoing down that alley, and it was getting louder as he got closer. This intimidating figure had decided to give me chase, and I wasn't going to wait around and let him catch me. I sprinted towards the woods as they were close by, and if I was unable to outrun this person, at least I could do my best to lose them in the darkness of the woods. As I entered the woods, it was pitch black. I could barely see my hand in front of my face, and I was thinking maybe I could hide, although I was too scared to stop until I had some distance between me and this guy. I knew these woods very well, as I've lived in this area my entire life, and I would walk my dog here daily, so even in the darkness, I had some clue as to where I was going. After a bit,
I realized I couldn't run anymore, and I decided my best hope of escape was to climb up a large tree. I don't think I ever climbed a tree so fast while trying to remain quiet, and I remember looking down and seeing the tree branches below in the darkness, and I was listening for these footsteps. I heard him. He had slowed his pace, likely as he could no longer hear mine, as I was now up in this tree. The sounds of his steps drew closer and closer, and I started to feel physically sick. And my stomach had knotted shut, and I was practically eating my heart as if it felt like it was coming up out of my throat. As I sat there frozen in fear, the footsteps started to get further away until all I could hear was silence and the odd rustle of trees from the wind blowing. A massive sigh of relief came over me. And now I was wondering, how long until I can make a break for it? I must have sat up there for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I was making myself go crazy just sitting and waiting. I mean, surely he was gone and the coast was clear. So I headed down the tree slowly and quietly, and once I reached the bottom, I looked around to check my surroundings. After a few seconds, I got an idea of where I was and started to slowly walk through the woods, making as little noise as possible. I decided to get my door keys out of my pocket and turn them into a makeshift knuckle duster in case this person crept up on me. While walking, I was on high alert listening to every single little sound, and I wanted to make sure if someone was close by, I knew about it. All I kept thinking was this person was hiding in the darkness, stalking me, and I was his prey. I've never felt so uneasy, and it was like all the trees had eyes, and they were looking right at me. It wasn't long until I reached the end of the woods, and home was almost within reach, and I decided I wasn't taking any risks, and I was going to make a break for it and sprint the rest of the way home. It was only about 300 meters from the entrance of the woods to my front door. As I was running, literally just from around the corner from my house, I took a look over my shoulder, and by the entrance of the woods, there he was, to my horror. He was still in pursuit, running from the entrance of the woods and in my direction. But luckily for me, he was a distance away, and I was almost at my doorstep. I got around the corner, and now I was at my front door, my brain overloaded with thoughts of classic horror scenes of people dropping their keys or failing to find the right key. Thankfully, I didn't make that mistake, and my keys were still in my hand. I opened my door, burst into my house, being cautious. I closed the door quickly and quietly behind me, trying to make as little noise as possible. No one was home, and I did not want this person to know where I lived. So I proceeded to run up the stairs and into my bedroom, which overlooked the street. And there, I saw him coming from around the corner, and he ran straight past my house, clearly looking as still in straight pursuit, chasing me down. I was overcome with relief. I mean, not only did I manage to narrowly escape from this deranged individual and whatever his intentions were if he caught me, thankfully, he didn't see where I lived. After I talked to some friends, I realized that those who lived on my street and others who lived close by had had multiple issues with this person, although he never went after us as a group. This probably isn't too terrifying to hear about. However, at the time, I wanted to be anywhere else but there. As a reference for later, I'm a male and I'm about 5'8", both now and back when this story took place. So about 5 years ago when I was 18, I was working in a supermarket in the UK. I always worked Friday nights till 10 p.m., and then despite it being the law to have at least an 11-hour gap between shifts, I was back in at 7 a.m. on Saturday morning. I lived nearby, and I had started driving about 6 months prior to this story. I used to smoke weed a lot back then. I currently still do, but probably only once every 2 months. It was a guy who I was friends with that I used to buy off of all the time. I'll call him Josh for the sake of the story. Every Friday, I'd finish work, get home, have a joint, and fulfill the inevitable munchies, and then get some sleep ready for my early start the next morning. I realized at about 8:30 p.m. during my shift that I didn't have any weed at home, so I dropped Josh a message, and just the standard, "Hey man, what do you got?" or something to that effect. He replied pretty sharpish, notifying me that he doesn't, but he could get some from his supplier no problem. However, there was a condition. Josh was having a sesh in a friend's field with some other friends in a nearby village, and therefore requested to be picked up so he could restock, sort me, and then be taken home. I thought about it for a moment, and then I realized I could easily be home for 11 p.m. after all of that, still allowing me to have a smoke and a bite to eat. I replied to Josh, telling him that there was no problem, and that I would finish at 10, and I'd probably be with him in about 15 minutes. Josh then replied, stating that he'll wait next to a wooded area on the side of the road to be picked up. Woods, huh? Might have been cause for some alarm bells, but it would inhibit my night's plans if I didn't go. Yep, no worries, I said, continuing to stack the shelves for the remainder of my shift. 10 p.m. comes around, and I text Josh to tell him I'm on the way. He texts back with "safe," and I begin driving. Despite this village being rather local, I'd never driven through it before. So once I got there, I called him, and I remember this conversation as if it happened yesterday because of how pissy I got. Josh spoke like a level 3 certified roadman, so I'll translate where I feel it's appropriate. "All right, dude, I'm in the village. Where you at?" I asked. "Safe, brother. Your man doesn't know shit, innit?" He basically didn't know. "Mandem's gonna shout you to Jake, and he'll bless you." To be fair, I didn't even think that made any sense at the time, but I caught the gist of what he was trying to say. Luckily, me and Jake knew each other, and he spoke normally. "All right, mate, it's Jake. Have you gone past the pub yet?" he asked. "I'm actually parked there now, man," I said. "Cool. Just keep driving the direction you came, and you'll eventually see us on the side of the road. I'm not coming along. Josh is a bit too blazed to know how to get to the road. Haha." So, with that, I continued driving and eventually found them. Josh got in, Jake said his goodbyes, I U-turned and drove back to familiar territory. We got to where he told me to go, and I just asked, "Is this your supplier's place?" Josh replied by saying no, it wasn't, and we're picking him up from here. I was getting annoyed again because I didn't agree to this, but I did want a smoke. I was going to need one after all of this, and Josh went into the house and was there for about 15 minutes. Yeah, I could have just driven off and left it, but I now realized I was in a questionable situation when Josh came back with a guy that was easily almost 7 feet tall. He was built like Arnie in Predator, and his whole aura just screamed drug dealer. "This is Jeff, the guy I was on about. We need to get to his place to get the stuff." Jeff? That name didn't fit his appearance, but I realized that given the situation. This guy walked around to my driver's side window, which was open. Towering over my car, he extended his fist for a fist bump. I bumped it, and he said, "Pop the boot, G." I told him it doesn't pop. You manually open it at the boot. But, wait a minute, why? He somewhat aggressively answers with, "Why the fuck do you think, bruv?" He looks up at the house he just emerged from and shouted, "Yo, put that shit in the boot." As Josh gets into the car next to me, I see through the passenger window 2 guys emerging with 2 backpacks each. "Josh, what the fuck are they doing?" "Restocking, man." "Well, me and Jeff both are, but I'm only interested in the weed," he answered in an assuming tone. "What do you mean? What else is in the bags? Can't we just get what we need and go?" I was getting twitchy at this point. Haha, better question is, what hasn't he got? He's a dealer, man. Weed, coke, MDMA, ketamine, acid, crack, morphine. Some heavy shit, bruv. My heart fell out of my arse. Before I could say anything, Jeff was in the back seat, almost taking up the whole space with his mass. The boot was closed, and the 2 mystery guys were just stepping back into the house. I sat there, hands on the wheel, constantly swallowing and starting to shake. "Fucking go! Drive!" Jeff shouted, and smacked the headrest of the driver's seat. I slowly pulled out and made the journey to his place, through tense directions supplied by the supplier himself. Jeff lit a cigarette in the back, so I stopped and asked him to put it out. I tried to be stern, but he just looked at me in the mirror and rolled the window down instead, saying nothing. I carried on, hearing some suspicious noises coming from the back, but I was more worried about not concentrating and seeing a police car drive past or something. We finally got there, and he told me to pull into this alleyway that leads to the back of the houses. So I pulled in, and Jeff told me to drive with my headlights off as to not draw any attention. Jeff got out of the car and proceeded to make a phone call. I turned to Josh and simply said, "I don't like this, man." To which he said, "It's chill. I don't think we have anything to worry about." For some reason, I then put my car in gear, which made Jeff, who now stood in front of my car, look up with fury in his eyes. He pretty much curb-stomped the front of my car, which made me stall and shunt forward. Jeff, now not worried about drawing attention to us, walked over to my window yelling, "Get out of the fucking car! Get the fuck out now!" I froze and looked at Josh, who just said, "Mate, we need to get out." All while Jeff was still screaming, "Get the fuck out now! I won't ask you again because you won't be in a state to hear it. I am not fucking around." He punched my wing mirror and it folded in. I jumped, turned the ignition off, and whipped my keys out, jumping out of the car quicker than I've ever moved before. Jeff pushed me back and I fell into some bins that were running along the alley, and by this point he'd pulled out a small blade and pointed it down at me. "Leave your keys and go with that fuckhead," he was pointing to Josh, "to the road and wait." By this point I had tears in the back of my eyes. I didn't want to leave my keys, but I heard the fear in Josh's voice as he said, "Yo, just give him the keys, man." I stood up, handed over my keys, and hastily backed away to the alley entrance. It was 12:30 in the morning at this point. I was tired, stressed, scared, and feeling sick. While standing at the road, I noticed a road sign that said the alleyway wasn't a through road, so I knew that he at least couldn't take my car. About 20 minutes passed, and Jeff reemerges, bladeless and with my keys in his hand. He hands them back and simply says, "Safe, G," and holds his other hand out, balled up in a fist. I couldn't speak. I just simply fist bumped him again and took my keys back. Josh then pipes in with, "We good, bro?" "You're far from good, mate. Get the fuck inside the house." Jeff then turns to me and says, "I'll see you around." I nodded, walked past him back to my car, and got in. Jeff walks past and asks with a normal, carefree tone, "Yo, you got any gum?" I again nodded, trying to hold back tears. I handed him a pack of gum, and he smiled and walked into his house behind Josh. I sat in there in silence for about 5 minutes, breathing heavily, finally letting my tears flow. I reversed out of the alley, turning my lights on as I got to the road, and went home, weedless. I got home, and the first thing I did was check my car inside and out. The backpacks were gone, and there was a fucking baggie on my back seat. Those suspicious noises I mentioned must have been Jeff snorting coke while we were in travel. What a fuck night. It was now about 10 after 1 by the time I got into bed, and I didn't sleep a wink. I still went straight to work that morning. Josh contacted me later that day, asking if I still wanted some, and that he'd compensate me for what had happened. I accepted and went to see him at his house after work, and he gave me some extra smoke for nothing. Turns out he was super behind on payments by at least £1,000, and he took a few punches once he got into Jeff's, as well as spending a few hours helping him bag up all of the product ready for distribution. Josh ended up repaying his debt and swiftly got out of the game not long after. I see him from time to time, and he's doing a lot better. Jeff, on the other hand, I never saw him again, and I plan to keep it that way.
Here in the forest, dark and deep, I offer you eternal sleep.